In 1830, the United States was a land of deep contradictions. While millions of African Americans remained in bondage, the census revealed something that continues to surprise and even unsettle many today. Nearly 3,800 free black individuals owned over 1,200 enslaved people. This reality was most visible in the bustling port cities of Savannah, Charleston, and New Orleans. Even more striking, some of these owners were free women of color who navigated a society that restricted them, yet managed to build wealth, communities, and legacies within a system designed to oppress them. Among these extraordinary figures, one name stands out: Matriarch Coincoin. Born in 1742 in the Louisiana frontier town of Natchitoches, she began life in chains, destined for obscurity. Yet her story did not end there. Against all odds, Coin carved out a path that transformed her into one of the most remarkable women of colonial America. From the cotton fields and disease-ridden homes where she first labored, to the thriving plantations and communities she later helped build, her journey is both inspiring and deeply complex. Coincoin's life was not just about survival, it was about resilience, ambition, and vision. She became a healer during epidemics, a businesswoman selling tobacco and medicines, a landowner amassing thousands of acres, and even a slaveholder herself. Her story challenges us to confront the uncomfortable truths of history, that people who once bore the scars of oppression could, in turn, participate in the very system that enslaved them. Yet at the same time, her choices allowed her to protect her family, secure freedom for her children, and create opportunities for generations to come. This story is more than a biography. It is a window into a forgotten chapter of American history, where free people of color built communities like Isle Brevel along the Cane River. They erected churches, ran plantations, and played pivotal roles in shaping Louisiana's Creole culture. From the chaos of colonial wars to the bloody battlefields of the Civil War, Coincoin's descendants carried forward her legacy, some fighting under the Confederate banner, others later giving their lives for the Union cause. Why does this matter today? Because history is rarely simple. It is full of paradoxes, contradictions, and human struggles that mirror our own questions about morality, power, and survival. By revisiting the life of Matriarch Coincoin, we uncover not just the resilience of one woman, but also the resilience of an entire community who dared to thrive in a world that wanted to silence them. If you are fascinated by untold stories, forgotten histories, and the people who shaped our past in unexpected ways, then this journey is for you. Join us as we dive into the life of Matriarch Coincoin, healer, entrepreneur, landowner, and pioneer. Her legacy will change the way you think about freedom, survival, and what it means to leave a mark on history. Do not forget to like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss future stories that reveal the hidden layers of our past. Your support helps us bring more voices from history back into the light. In the early decades of the 19th century, America was a nation caught in contradictions, a place where ideals of liberty coexisted with deeply entrenched systems of control and exploitation. And within this world there were stories that often defied expectations. Stories that challenged the way history is commonly remembered. And one of the most remarkable among them is that of Matriarch Coincoin, a woman whose life journey moved from the boundaries of bondage to the heights of ownership and influence. A journey that reveals the tangled complexities of race, identity, and power in early Louisiana. Born in 1742 in the French colony of Louisiana, Matriarch was brought into a world where culture, faith, and survival were in constant negotiation. And from an early age she knew the hardships of labor and the limitations imposed upon her life. She lived during a time when Louisiana was still a place of shifting rule, where French, Spanish, and later American laws shape people's fates in unpredictable ways. And in that uncertain world, she learned resilience and resourcefulness. Her story is not one of sudden transformation but of decades of persistence, seizing opportunities where few were offered and building a legacy that would outlast her lifetime. The turning point came through her association with a French merchant named Claude Thomas Pierre Mitoyer, with whom she formed a lasting relationship that altered the course of her life. Though she began as a woman marked by servitude, she eventually secured her own freedom, and more importantly, the freedom of her children, ensuring that the next generation would not inherit the same restrictions that had defined her early years. This act alone was extraordinary, for it required courage, strategy, and immense sacrifice. Yet what makes her story even more striking is what followed. Because Marie Therese did not simply retreat into a quiet existence after gaining her liberty, but instead she built a life that rivaled many of her contemporaries in wealth, property, and influence. By the time of her later years, she had become a landowner of significant standing, accumulating acres of fertile ground along the Cane River in Louisiana. On this land she established her family and her legacy, becoming the matriarch of the Mitoyer clan, one of the most prominent Creole families in Louisiana history. But like other free people of color during this time, her rise to prominence was tied to a reality that remains unsettling to modern eyes. She herself became a slaveholder, managing labor in the same system she had once been subject to. This contradiction reflects the broader patterns seen in the 1830 census, where thousands of free black Americans owned enslaved people, often in cities like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. For some, ownership was a means of protecting loved ones within a hostile society, while for others it became a way of achieving status, wealth, and stability. Marie Therese embodied both dimensions of this paradox, using the system both as a shield for her children and as a ladder for her prosperity. Her legacy forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that history is rarely a story of clear heroes and villains, but rather a mosaic of human choices shaped by circumstance, survival, and ambition. In her world, freedom was not guaranteed by laws or proclamations but had to be bought, defended, and expanded through relentless effort. For her, ownership was not simply about wealth. It was about security in a society that could easily strip everything away from a person of color. And yet, even as she sought protection for her family, she participated in a structure that inflicted the same hardships on others that she herself had endured. This tension makes her story both inspiring and unsettling, a mirror of the complicated realities of her time. The life of Marie Therese Coincoin reminds us that history cannot be understood through simple categories, because she was neither only a victim nor solely a beneficiary, but someone who navigated a world of limited options and carved out power in the only ways available to her. Her name, remembered across Louisiana, is tied to a story of transformation from bondage to prominence, and her descendants would continue to shape the region for generations. The Mitoyer family became landowners, planters, and cultural leaders, cementing their place in Louisiana's history as one of the most significant Creole lineages. And at the center of it all was a woman who refused to let her beginnings define her end. By weaving her journey into the broader story of free black ownership in America, we see a fuller picture of how complex the early 19th century truly was, for it was not only a story of oppression but also of resilience, ambition, and difficult choices. The fact that nearly 3,800 free black Americans owned over 1,200 enslaved people by 1,830 shows just how widespread and intricate this pattern had become, particularly in the bustling port cities where commerce and culture collided. Yet in rural Louisiana, along the Cane River, Marie Therese built something that set her apart, a legacy that continues to spark debate, admiration, and reflection to this day. Her story, like so many others from this period, challenges us to go beyond simple narratives and instead confront the messy reality of how people lived, survived, and sometimes thrived in a society built on inequality. It forces us to ask difficult questions. How far would someone go to secure their family's future? What compromises would they make? And at what cost? These are not only questions for the past, but ones that still echo in our world today, where the balance between ambition and morality, between survival and justice, continues to shape lives. Through her resilience and ambition, Matriarch Coincoin transformed the trajectory of her family. But in doing so, she also left behind a story that resists easy judgment. It is precisely this complexity that makes her narrative so powerful, because it forces us to see history not as a flat tale of victims and oppressors, but as a human story, filled with contradictions, aspirations, and choices that continue to resonate across time. Matriarch Coincoin's life was rooted in a beginning that seemed, at first glance, defined by limitation, but it was precisely these humble origins that made her eventual rise so remarkable. Born in Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana, she entered the world in 1742 as the fourth of 11 children in a family whose story reflected the complexity of early colonial society. Her mother was believed to be African-born, a woman who carried with her the memories and traditions of a distant homeland, while her father was possibly a French colonist, a man whose presence added another layer to the already intricate cultural fabric of her heritage. This blending of worlds, African, French, and the unique Creole identity that grew in Louisiana, would shape the course of Matriarch's destiny in ways few could have imagined when she first opened her eyes to the harsh realities of bondage. From her earliest years, she lived within a system that sought to dictate every aspect of her existence. Yet even within that confining structure, sparks of resilience emerged. She was not merely one among many children in a crowded household. She was a girl who observed, absorbed, and carried within her an unyielding determination to carve a life that would not be confined by the narrow boundaries others had set for her. The environment of Natchitoches Parish itself contributed to her story. It was a region where cultures collided, where French, Spanish, Native American, and African influences intertwined, creating a society unlike any other in North America. In this world, the rigid lines of identity were sometimes blurred, and within those spaces of ambiguity, possibilities for transformation could be found. Matriarch's childhood was not one of ease. To be born enslaved meant that her labor and her future were considered the property of others. Yet, unlike many who were silenced by circumstance, she demonstrated from an early age a will to resist invisibility. Family ties offered both comfort and challenge. For being one of 11 children meant she grew up surrounded by siblings who shared in her burdens and hopes. These relationships would later prove significant, as family networks often provided the emotional foundation and practical alliances that could support a person's climb from subjugation to independence. It is important to understand the paradox of her position. Though her father may have been a French colonist, she did not inherit privilege from that lineage. Instead, she inherited the condition of her mother, the African-born woman whose life had been marked by forced displacement. This contrast between her ancestry and her lived reality is what gives her story such poignancy, for it highlights the way heritage could simultaneously elevate and marginalize a person in colonial Louisiana. As she grew, Matriarch became more deeply aware of the world around her, a world in which survival required not only physical endurance but also keen intelligence and adaptability. She would have learned to navigate the languages of her environment: French, perhaps some African dialects preserved within her community, and the Creole tongue that evolved in the colony. These linguistic skills were more than tools of communication. They were instruments of empowerment, giving her access to multiple cultural spheres and allowing her to build connections that would serve her in later years. The early decades of her life also introduced her to the contradictions of colonial Louisiana's society. While bondage was pervasive, the French and later Spanish colonial systems sometimes allowed for pathways of manumission, especially for those who could demonstrate loyalty, skill, or economic potential. This fragile opening in the system was rare, but it was enough to suggest that the conditions of one's birth did not always dictate the full trajectory of one's life. For a young woman like Marie-Therese, this possibility would have flickered like a distant light, a reminder that hope, though faint, was not absent. Her formative years thus became a crucible where resilience was forged. She endured hardship, yes, but she also developed the endurance, vision, and pragmatism that would eventually propel her into roles few could have envisioned for someone who began life in chains. To look at her childhood only as a period of suffering would be to miss the profound ways in which it laid the groundwork for her future achievements. She was learning, even then, how to see beyond the present moment, how to recognize opportunities where others might see only obstacles, and how to nurture an identity that would one day transcend the limitations placed upon her. Marie-Therese's story cannot be separated from her heritage, for it was this very mix of African resilience and French influence that produced the Creole identity she came to embody. She was neither wholly of one world nor another, and in that liminal space, she found a source of strength. Being of mixed descent meant she could sometimes move between cultural spheres, using her knowledge of traditions, languages, and customs to navigate complex social landscapes. In a region as fluid as Natchitoches Parish, this ability to adapt was not merely advantageous, it was vital. By the time she reached young adulthood, Marie-Therese had already absorbed the lessons of endurance, adaptation, and ambition. The girl, born as the fourth of 11 children, with no rights and no recognized claim to her father's legacy, was quietly building the foundation for a life that would one day astonish even those who had once looked upon her as property. She would go on to challenge the expectations of her time, transforming herself into a woman of wealth, land, and influence, a figure whose legacy still resonates in Louisiana's history. But the roots of that transformation lay here, in the story of a child born into hardship who refused to let those circumstances define the limits of her destiny. From the very beginning, life had placed Coincoin on a path that demanded resilience, resourcefulness, and a kind of quiet strength that few could imagine. Born in Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana, the fourth child among 11 siblings, she carried within her a heritage that reflected the blending of worlds. Her mother was most likely born in Africa, carrying memories of traditions and survival across the Atlantic, while her father may have been a French colonist whose presence introduced another layer to the complexity of her lineage. This mix of cultures, though born from circumstances beyond her control, became part of the foundation that shaped her outlook on life and the unique role she would later play in her community. It was in this environment rich in contradictions and marked by both suffering and opportunity that Coincoin's story began to unfold. As a child, her days were filled with back-breaking work in the fields, where the rhythm of the seasons dictated the pace of life. Yet beyond the labor that shaped her body and spirit, Coincoin's mind absorbed lessons that would later prove invaluable. When outbreaks of plague and sickness swept through the region, leaving fear in their wake, Coincoin found herself drawn into the urgent need for care. She trained as a nurse and healer, learning both through experience and from the whispers of traditional knowledge carried by elders who preserved African medicinal practices. Herbs, roots, and remedies that had crossed oceans became part of her education, blending with European practices she encountered in Louisiana. This unlikely merging of two medical traditions gave her a distinctive set of skills that would sustain her long after others might have faltered. Her role as a healer was not merely about mixing herbs or tending to wounds. It was about stepping into a place of trust within her community. People who had little else to rely on turned to her for relief. And in answering those calls, Coincoin found a sense of purpose that transcended the harshness of her circumstances. The work was exhausting, yet every life she touched deepened her sense that she was meant for more than the limits society tried to impose upon her. This identity as a healer became intertwined with her very being, a gift that gave her both independence and a quiet dignity that others could not strip away. Coincoin's training and growing reputation as a nurse also created subtle shifts in how she was perceived by those around her, while she was still bound within the structures of her society. The fact that she could offer knowledge and care that others desperately needed gave her leverage. In times when illness spread without mercy, her presence was not just useful, it was essential. She earned not only gratitude, but also the beginnings of recognition, planting seeds of respect that would later blossom into more tangible opportunities. For a woman of her background, these opportunities were rare, but she seized them with both hands, refusing to let them slip away. The memory of those early years, the calloused hands from the fields, the sleepless nights tending to the sick, the moments of relief when a fever broke or a wound healed never left her. They became the fabric of her character, woven into every choice she made as her life expanded into new chapters. In a world that often sought to reduce her to a single role, Coincoin instead carved out a space where her intelligence, skill, and perseverance could flourish. She transformed hardship into knowledge, pain into healing, and limitation into possibility. These experiences in childhood and early adulthood did more than prepare her for survival. They prepared her to thrive. The lessons she absorbed about medicine, about the fragility of life, and about the resilience of the human spirit gave her tools that extended far beyond physical healing. They gave her insight into human nature itself, teaching her how to navigate relationships, build trust, and find strength in the most unlikely places. It was this combination of endurance and wisdom that would carry her forward into later years, when she would take on roles that neither she nor anyone else could have predicted in those early days. Though her path was shaped by hardship, it was also marked by an unmistakable sense of destiny. Every child who survived her care, every neighbor who found relief in her remedies, and every lesson learned under the shadow of plague added to her story. And within that story, Coincoin was quietly becoming more than just a child of mixed heritage born into difficult circumstances. She was becoming a woman whose name would eventually carry weight across generations, remembered not just for what she endured, but for how she transformed those struggles into a legacy that could not be erased. She had 5 children with a fellow enslaved man named Chatter, though his fate is uncertain, and this chapter of her life carried both joy and sorrow, shaping her identity in ways that would echo through the years. In the harshness of her world, where families were so often torn apart and futures were dictated by forces beyond their control, the act of building a family was both a rebellion and an expression of hope. Each child represented a small spark of light in a life shadowed by hardship, and through them, she could glimpse the possibility of legacy, continuity, and a bond that could not be easily erased. Chatter himself, though his story would eventually slip away into the uncertainties of history, stood beside her during these years as a partner who shared her burdens, her fears, and her fleeting moments of laughter in the quiet corners of their existence. His presence, though fragile and temporary, offered her a sense of belonging that she had long been denied, and together they tried to create a world of meaning within one that constantly sought to strip it away. The details of what became of Chatter are lost, leaving only silence where his story might have been, and this uncertainty adds a haunting layer to her journey. Did he perish in the endless cycles of labor and disease that swept through their community? Or was he sold and scattered elsewhere, his life pulled away by the same relentless tide that claimed so many? Whatever the truth, the absence of clarity makes his memory both fragile and enduring, a reminder of how easily lives could vanish without record, and how love and partnership were often forced to exist in the shadow of loss. Yet even without knowing the end of his path, The children they brought into the world together carried a trace of his presence, ensuring that something of him remained even when his body and voice were gone. For her, raising 5 children under such circumstances was nothing short of extraordinary, a constant balancing act between survival and nurture. She drew upon the skills she had developed earlier in her life, especially her knowledge of medicine and healing, to care for them in ways that went beyond the limited resources they were provided. When fever struck or wounds festered, she turned to herbs, to roots she gathered when she could, and to the wisdom passed down through generations of women before her. These practices not only kept her children alive through the constant threats of illness, but also instilled in them a sense of resilience and a connection to traditions that resisted erasure. Every remedy she prepared was more than an act of survival. It was a way of preserving knowledge and asserting identity in the face of oppression. The children themselves embodied both vulnerability and promise. In their laughter she found a reprieve from the weight of her daily reality. In their cries a reminder of the fragility of life, and in their growing strength the possibility that the world could change, even if only incrementally. Through them, each child carried with them not only her blood but also the complicated history of their father, Chatter, a man who may have vanished from her side, but whose spirit lingered in the curve of a smile, the shape of a hand, or the determination in their eyes. Through them, she was never entirely alone, even when circumstances left her feeling otherwise, and they became both her greatest responsibility and her greatest triumph. Her relationship with Chatter, though shadowed by the uncertainty of its ending, provided her with a rare sense of intimacy in a life defined by instability. In a world where human connections were constantly threatened, where trust could be shattered in an instant by forces beyond their control, their bond was a quiet act of resistance. It reminded her that she was still capable of choosing affection, of sharing herself, and of creating something larger than the suffering imposed upon her. That bond, fragile as it was, became a memory she carried forward even after he was gone, and in moments of despair she could recall his presence as proof that she had once been more than just a survivor. She had been a partner, a mother, and a woman who dared to hope. As her children grew, she passed on more than just survival skills. She gave them the foundation of resilience and wisdom that would shape their futures. She told them stories of strength, of people who had endured far more than they could imagine. And she taught them that even in the darkest of circumstances, their lives held meaning. The value she instilled: endurance, resourcefulness, and the courage to keep going were as much a part of their inheritance as the blood that ran through their veins. In this way, she ensured that the legacy she and Chatter began would not be erased, even if his name faded into obscurity and her own life remained shadowed by hardship. The uncertainty surrounding Chatter's fate became part of the narrative she lived with every day, a reminder that love and family in her world were often tenuous and fragile. Yet instead of allowing that uncertainty to hollow her out, she transformed it into determination, choosing to focus on what she could preserve: the lives of her children, the knowledge she passed down, and the unbreakable bond that tethered them together. Through them, Chatter was never entirely gone, and neither was she ever entirely alone. Even in the silence where his story should have been, she found a way to weave continuity, ensuring that their shared love left a mark not only on her but on the generations that followed. In the end, the story of her 5 children and her bond with Chatter is not merely one of loss or uncertainty but of endurance and creation. It is about how, in a world designed to fracture and erase, she managed to hold onto something deeply human, something that gave her the strength to keep moving forward. Her children became living testaments to her resilience, her skills, and her refusal to surrender to despair, and through them, she ensured that both her story and Chatter's would continue to echo, even if history failed to record their full truth. Around the year 1765, as the world around her shifted with the tides of colonial ambition and cultural entanglement. Marie found herself at a crossroads in her life. She had endured years of hardship, marked by uncertainty and the absence of control over her destiny. Yet even within those confines she carried herself with a quiet resilience that set her apart. It was during this time that she encountered Claude Thomas Pierre Matoya, a French merchant whose presence would change the trajectory of her story in ways neither could have fully anticipated at the time. Their meeting was not one of fairy tales, nor was it free from the complexities of the world they inhabited. But it was the beginning of a long and transformative relationship that reshaped not only Mary's life, but also the legacy she will leave behind. Matoya was a man of ambition and means, a figure deeply embedded in the mercantile networks of the French colonial world. He represented both opportunity and risk, for relationships such as theirs were fraught with scrutiny, whispers, and the weight of social expectation. Yet amid those shadows, a bond grew that went beyond the fleeting encounters often shaped by imbalance or circumstance. Marie, who had already demonstrated an unshakable will to survive, saw in this connection not merely affection but the possibility of a life that could extend beyond survival into something resembling agency. In Matoya, she found someone willing to recognize her humanity, and in her, he saw strength and determination that challenged the conventions of the society they lived in. Their relationship unfolded in a period where every choice carried immense consequence. For Mary, whose life until then had been defined by limits imposed by others, the bond with Matoya offered a rare kind of stability. It was not immediate liberation, nor was it the end of her struggles, but it planted the seeds of transformation. As years passed, their connection deepened, and while society might have categorized it through its own narrow lens, for Mary it was a pathway to something she had long imagined but scarcely allowed herself to hope for: freedom. The years between 1765 and 1778 were a delicate balance of endurance and aspiration, of waiting for a moment when circumstance and determination could align in her favor. By 1778, after more than a decade of shared life, Claude Thomas Pierre Matoya made a decision that would forever alter Mary's path. He purchased her freedom. For most, freedom was an abstract dream, spoken about in hushed tones, rarely realized, and often taken away as quickly as it was gained. For Mary, however, this act was not just the breaking of chains, but the opening of a door into a new chapter that few in her position ever had the chance to write. To be freed was extraordinary in itself, but to have that freedom secured by someone who had chosen to stand by her for so many years added layers of complexity and meaning. It was an act that recognized her as more than property. More than circumstance, it was an acknowledgement of her worth, her presence, her spirit. Yet freedom was not a simple gift, nor was it a guarantee of ease. Mary stepped into her new status with the same strength that had carried her through her earlier struggles. She had children to consider, a future to build, and a world still structured against her success. But now, for the first time, the choices ahead were hers to make. The relationship with Matoya did not end with her freedom. Instead, it evolved into something more enduring. Together, they would build a family and carve out a space in a society that was not designed to accept them on equal terms. Their union challenged conventions, raising eyebrows among both the French elite and the Creole communities. But it endured, a testament to resilience and determination in a world that offered little room for either. Marie's story at this stage becomes more than one of survival, it transforms into one of creation. She was no longer only enduring the world as it came. She was shaping a life for herself and her children. The freedom she gained in 1778 was a turning point, not a conclusion, and the years that followed would see her evolve into a figure of remarkable influence. The courage to embrace this new chapter was deeply rooted in the years of hardship that preceded it, in the strength forged through endurance and loss, and in the quiet determination that had always carried her forward. Matoya's decision to free her was undeniably pivotal, but it was Mary's own willpower, her vision, and her refusal to be defined solely by her past that allowed her to seize that opportunity and transform it into something far greater. In remembering this chapter of her life, it is not enough to view it only through the lens of dependence or benevolence. Marie's freedom was not simply given, it was earned through her resilience, her ability to navigate the intricate dynamics of her time, and her unyielding spirit. The year 1778 marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, where she would rise from the margins of society to carve her own space in history, with Claude Thomas Pierre Matoya by her side. She entered into a life that was still fraught with challenges, but for the first time, those challenges were faced with the knowledge that she had crossed a threshold few before her had ever managed to reach. And in doing so, Marie not only secured her own liberation, but laid the foundations for a legacy that would endure long after her lifetime. Once freedom was no longer a distant dream but a living reality. Coincoin's life transformed in ways that few could have imagined for a woman born into bondage. No longer confined by the harsh restrictions that had once dictated her every move, she began to carve out a new identity not as a dependent or a survivor, but as a woman of vision and remarkable resilience. Many might have assumed that once liberated, she would remain quietly in the background, grateful simply to live without chains. But that was never her way. Instead, she poured her energy into building a life that bore the unmistakable stamp of independence, courage, and ingenuity. She refused to be defined by her past or limited by the expectations of the colonial society around her, where women, especially women of color, were rarely granted acknowledgement beyond the most basic roles. Coincoin understood something profound. Freedom was not only about escaping captivity, it was about using opportunity to its fullest. And she approached that challenge with boldness. She turned to the land first, working tirelessly to cultivate tobacco, a crop that required both patience and skill. The rows she planted symbolized more than agriculture. They represented persistence, discipline, and her refusal to be outdone in a trade dominated by men who had long dismissed the capacity of women to succeed in such pursuits. Where others saw hardship in coaxing fragile leaves from the soil, she saw possibility, and the fields she cultivated were a testament to her determination. Her work did not end there. However, she expanded her reach into medicine, drawing from both African traditions and the knowledge she acquired in the colony to craft remedies that were trusted by those around her. Whether treating an illness or offering a tonic, her medicines carried the weight of experience and the mark of authenticity, giving her a reputation as someone whose wisdom and resourcefulness could not be ignored. Coincoin's ventures also carried her into the wilderness, where she engaged in hunting with the same practicality and fearlessness that had guided her in every other sphere of her life. The hunt was more than survival. It was an act of agency, a declaration that she could provide for herself and her family in ways that once would have been unthinkable. Trading animal skins and meat, she built relationships across economic and cultural lines, entering circles of exchange that brought her into contact with trappers, settlers, and traders from distant places. Her ability to adapt to each environment, whether the cultivated field, the medicinal garden, or the untamed forest, proved her extraordinary versatility. Each business she undertook was not an isolated effort, but a piece of a larger design, where survival evolved into success and success became a platform for legacy. What made her story remarkable was not simply the range of her enterprises, but the spirit in which she pursued them. She was not content to follow a single path, but instead explored every avenue available, building a life with multiple foundations. Her willingness to engage in different trades reflected a mind that was both practical and visionary, able to recognize opportunities where others might see limitations. In a world where so many were forced into narrow roles, she demonstrated that freedom meant the right to choose to work the land, to heal the sick, to venture into forests, to trade in the markets, and to decide for herself what kind of life to lead. In all of this, Coincoin was not merely surviving day by day. She was establishing something enduring. Her independence allowed her to teach her children the value of perseverance and resourcefulness, passing down not only the fruits of her labor, but the example of her strength. Each enterprise she managed was a declaration that a woman who had once been denied control over her own life could rise to become a figure of influence and respect. She turned freedom into more than a personal gift. It became a tool to shape her community, to carve out space where her presence could not be ignored, and to prove that identity was not confined to the labels imposed by others. Through tobacco fields that stretched under the southern sun, through the careful preparation of medicines, through the echo of footsteps in the wilderness, and through the exchange of goods that carried her reputation further than she might have dreamed, Coincoin demonstrated that liberation was not an endpoint, but a beginning. Her story was not one of quiet retreat, but of bold expansion, the kind of life that challenges assumptions and rewrites the expectations of an era. She embodied the truth that freedom, when embraced fully, could transform not only one woman's destiny, but also the lives of those who would come after her, leaving behind a legacy built not on titles or wealth alone, but on courage, persistence, and an unshakable will to live life on her own terms. In the heart of colonial Louisiana, where cultures intertwined in uneasy balance, Coincoin's life unfolded with a complexity that seemed to defy the rigid expectations of her world. She had already shown herself to be resilient, determined, and resourceful, building businesses that gave her both independence and respect within her community. Yet her personal life would prove even more complicated, for it was not merely about survival or prosperity, but about love and the boundaries imposed by society. Her relationship with Claude Thomas Pierre Matoya, a French merchant, was a profound bond that challenged the prevailing conventions of the time, and it soon placed her in direct conflict with one of the most powerful institutions of the era, the Catholic Church. The Church, deeply entwined with the social and cultural order of Louisiana, was far from accepting of the relationship. For them, love across the boundaries of race and status was not simply a personal matter, but a threat to the hierarchy that upheld the colonial world. Priests and church officials intervened, attempting to drive a wedge between Coincoin and Matoya, urging him to abandon the relationship in favor of one that would be deemed respectable in the eyes of both faith and society. It was a painful intrusion, not only questioning their commitment to each other, but also forcing them to confront how little their feelings mattered in a society that prized order and conformity above all. Yet Matoya, unlike many others of his class and standing, did not yield to the pressure. Though he was deeply tied to the church himself, he chose to stand by Coincoin, even as whispers and judgment swirled around them. The interference of the church did not break their bond. In fact, it forced Matoya into a decision that would alter both of their lives forever: to shield Coincoin from the constant threat of separation and to secure her place in a world that did not want to recognize her autonomy. He took an extraordinary step. He purchased her freedom, a gesture that was both pragmatic and deeply symbolic. For in that act he declared that her worth was not to be diminished by laws or customs, and that their connection could withstand even the might of religious authority. Freedom, however, was never granted without cost, and for Coincoin it came with both liberation and new responsibilities. To be a free woman in Louisiana was to step into a precarious middle ground, one that offered opportunities but also carried risks. She had to navigate suspicion from white society, which resented the idea of people of color achieving success, as well as skepticism from her own community, who sometimes viewed free people with mixed emotions. But with Matoya's support and her own indomitable spirit, she forged ahead, turning her freedom into a foundation upon which to build something lasting. What made this chapter of her life so compelling was not only the drama of love against the odds, but also the quiet, steadfast resolve that defined Coincoin's choices. Where others might have crumbled under the weight of opposition, she seemed to draw strength from adversity. The attempt by the church to tear them apart had the opposite effect, galvanizing her will and solidifying Matoya's commitment. Together, they created a partnership that transcended mere survival. Their bond became a statement, a living contradiction to the rigid categories that colonial Louisiana sought to enforce. Is easy. Centuries later, to underestimate the courage it took for both of them to live openly in defiance of such powerful pressures. The church did not simply represent faith. It was the guardian of moral and social order, wielding immense influence over daily life. To oppose it, even quietly, was an act of profound risk. Yet Coincoin and Matoya's story reminds us that even in eras of rigid control, human connection could break through barriers, carving out spaces of freedom where none were thought possible. In time, Coincoin's freedom allowed her to flourish in ways that would have been unimaginable had she remained bound by the constraints of enslavement. She could build her enterprises with greater security, raise her family with more stability, and contribute to a growing community of free people of color whose legacy would endure for generations. Each of these accomplishments was inseparable from the moment Matoya chose to act against the dictates of the church, prioritizing love and loyalty over convention. Their story is more than a tale of romance. It is a testament to resilience and defiance in the face of structures designed to limit human possibility. The Catholic Church, with all its authority, could not extinguish the flame of their relationship, and in resisting its demands, Coincoin and Matoya set into motion a legacy that stretched far beyond their lifetimes. Their children, their enterprises, and the community they helped nurture became living proof that the human spirit is not easily subdued, that even in the most constrained environments, freedom can be claimed and dignity preserved. Thus, what began as a forbidden love, shadowed by opposition and moral judgment, evolved into one of the most transformative turning points in Coincoin's life. The church resistance, meant to sever her from Matoya, instead propelled her toward a freedom that reshaped her destiny. It was in this crucible of conflict that Coincoin emerged not only as a free woman, but as a figure of strength, vision, and endurance, a woman who refused to let others dictate the terms of her existence, and whose story still echoes as a testament to the power of love and the courage of those who dare to defy convention. In the years that followed, Coincoin's determination and sharp mind began to shape a life that was both extraordinary and complicated. Having endured so many hardships and injustices, she refused to let the limits imposed on her define her future. Step by step, she carved out a world in which she not only survived but also built something lasting. Yet with that progress came choices that carried heavy moral weight, decisions that reveal the layered complexities of her time and her character. When Coincoin began to acquire enslaved people, it was not with the same intentions as those who treated human beings as commodities to be bought and sold without thought. For her, the first act of purchase was deeply personal and protective. She had seen too many families torn apart, too many loved ones separated forever. The trauma of her own life had instilled in her a fierce desire to shield those closest to her from that same fate. In those early moments, she used her limited means not for luxury or comfort but for family preservation, making sure that her children and kin would not be scattered, lost, or taken away by others who would not care for them. It was a gesture of defense, an attempt to keep her fragile community intact within a system that thrived on tearing it apart. But as Coincoin's land holdings expanded and her agricultural ventures grew, the reality of labor needs began to press upon her. The fertile soil of Louisiana was generous, but it demanded constant work clearing, planting, tending, harvesting, to maintain her farm, which by then had become a source of stability for her children and grandchildren. She turned to acquiring additional enslaved workers, This was not the same as the powerful planters who amassed hundreds of lives for their profit. Coincoin's holdings were modest in comparison. Yet the fact remained. She owned people, and she benefited from their work. Contemporaries often remarked that she was unlike the typical slaveholder. Instead of distancing herself from the physical work of the fields, she labored alongside those she owned. She knew the grueling tasks intimately because she had endured them herself. To many who observed her, this created an unusual dynamic. A woman who bore the title of owner but still shared in the sweat and exhaustion of daily toil. Her reputation spread as someone who managed with firmness but also with humanity. A person who had not forgotten the pain of bondage even while she participated in the system. For the people she held, life under Coincoin may have looked different than on other plantations. She was remembered as someone who provided a degree of dignity within the crushing framework of slavery. Someone who treated her workers less as faceless laborers and more as individuals bound together in a shared struggle. Yet even with that recognition, it does not erase the contradictions of her story. To own another person, regardless of intention or kindness, was still to participate in a practice that denied freedom and agency. It is here that her life reveals one of the deepest paradoxes of history. That those once oppressed could, under certain circumstances, become part of the very structure that oppressed others. Coincoin's choices cannot be understood in isolation. They were shaped by her time, her place, and her desire to secure a future for her large family. In an environment where power was almost entirely concentrated in the hands of white men, her path to stability required navigating that structure rather than dismantling it. For a woman of African descent, for a former enslaved person, the opportunities were razor-thin, and survival often meant compromise. By acquiring workers, she created a buffer that sustained her farm, ensured her children would inherit something more than hardship, and allowed her legacy to take root. As her farm prospered, the echoes of those compromises continued to ripple outward. Her descendants grew up in a world where the foundation of their stability came from both the resilience of their matriarch and the labor of those she had purchased. Oral histories and records describe her as a figure both admired and questioned. A woman whose life refused to fit neatly into the categories of victim or oppressor. Instead, she existed in the blurred space between, embodying both survival and contradiction. What makes Coincoin's story so compelling is not that she was flawless, but that she was human in the truest sense, complicated, layered, caught between the desire to protect her family and the reality of living within a system designed to strip people of that very possibility. She was strong, ambitious, and shrewd, yet she was also a woman bound by the circumstances of her era. Her ownership of slaves, however modest compared to others, forces us to reflect on how people adapt when caught in systems larger than themselves. It challenges us to move beyond simplistic categories and to see the past in its full, often uncomfortable, complexity. In telling her story, one cannot ignore the sorrow that her decisions carried, nor the fact that others bore the weight of her prosperity. But equally, one cannot dismiss the courage it took for her to transform her position from bondage to landowner, from outsider to matriarch of a lineage that would carry her name through generations. She built something enduring in the face of overwhelming odds, even if the means she used remind us of the tangled moral landscape of history. Coincoin's life is therefore a mirror of the world she inhabited, a world where freedom and bondage were not always opposites, but often overlapped in ways that defy our modern expectations. To understand her is to acknowledge that history is rarely clean or comfortable, and that within its folds live stories like her stories of survival, contradiction, and the complex pursuit of dignity in the harshest of circumstances. The story of Coincoin's transformation from a woman bound by circumstance into one of the most remarkable figures of Louisiana's Creole society continues with the tale of how she expanded her influence and secured a lasting place in history. After years of resilience and determination, She did not simply survive the hardships that once defined her life, she managed to carve out an extraordinary legacy for her children and the generations that followed. Her ability to acquire land was at the center of this transformation, and it revealed both her skill as a strategist and her unyielding will to create something that could not be easily taken away. At a time when opportunities for people of her background were scarce, Coincoin received and purchased several land grants, gradually piecing together an estate that grew to thousands of acres. Each acquisition was not just a piece of property, but a symbol of triumph against the social and economic forces that had once sought to confine her. What makes her story especially compelling is how she approached ownership. Land was more than wealth. It was a foundation for security, power, and respectability in a society that measured status by property lines and agricultural output. With each new grant and purchase, Coincoin created a buffer for her family against the uncertainties of the world outside, ensuring that her children and grandchildren would not face the same vulnerabilities she once endured. The land also gave them a foothold in a community where Creole families of color could, under the right conditions, build influence alongside French settlers and free people of European descent. Her determination was not solely for herself, it was always tied to the future of her lineage. As her holdings expanded, the family she nurtured began to establish themselves as one of the most prominent Creole landowning clans in Louisiana. This rise was not sudden but the result of decades of persistence, negotiation, and labor. Her descendants were raised with an awareness that their mother's or grandmother's struggles had been transformed into a new opportunity, one that demanded responsibility and resilience in turn. Land ownership meant they could not be ignored. They were no longer viewed only as individuals of mixed heritage navigating the rigid lines of colonial society, but as part of a powerful family whose resources gave them authority. The transformation of Coincoin's name from that of a woman once constrained by others into the matriarch of a powerful dynasty shows how deeply her vision shaped the world around her. But it is important to understand that her success was not simply a matter of chance. She operated in a world of contracts, notarial records, alliances, and community ties. To manage thousands of acres required not only physical strength and determination, but also a remarkable capacity to negotiate with officials, neighbors, and business partners. She proved herself in every one of those realms. Contemporary accounts and family records suggest that her reputation carried weight, not because she wielded authority in the way men of her era might have, but because she embodied both practicality and wisdom. She was trusted, respected, and occasionally feared for her persistence in defending what was hers. Coincoin's land holdings also marked a significant shift in how her story is remembered. For women of her time, particularly women of African descent or mixed ancestry, the ability to command property was rare. That rarity makes her achievements even more striking. She stood as an example that the boundaries society erected could sometimes be crossed. Though only with extraordinary courage and careful maneuvering, her descendants would carry this example forward, expanding their family influence, intermarrying with other notable Creole families, and becoming central to the cultural and economic development of Louisiana. Her legacy became not only about survival, but about thriving in a world that had been stacked against her. Walking through the lands she once claimed, one might imagine the sight of fertile fields stretching across the horizon, worked by her family and those they employed. These acres represented sweat, strategy, and sacrifice, but also a vision that refused to be confined by the limits of her beginnings. Coincoin's journey had begun with vulnerability and struggle, yet it ended with her family firmly planted in the social and economic structure of the colony. They were Creoles of significance, landowners who influenced their community and who could claim pride in a history tied to resilience. In telling Coincoin's story, her land ownership is not just a detail, it is the climax of a life that turned obstacles into opportunities. Her growth from a woman protecting her children and seeking stability into the matriarch of one of Louisiana's most prominent Creole clans reveals the power of determination combined with vision. Every acre she claimed, every transaction she pursued, and every field her family cultivated added to a story that outlasted her lifetime. Her descendants lived as proof that what began with hardship could end in strength, and that the choices of one determined woman could ripple across centuries. Coincoin's name may not always appear in grand histories, but within the soil of Louisiana, her presence is unmistakable, tied to the land she claimed and the legacy she forged. Her story did not end with her own remarkable rise. In fact, it was only the beginning of a legacy that would ripple far beyond her lifetime, carried forward by her children and their descendants who transformed the fertile land she had carefully secured into the heart of an enduring cultural landscape. From the soil she had once purchased with the determination of someone intent on building something lasting, her family constructed Merrow's Plantation, a place that became not just a home but a vibrant center of Creole culture and creativity in Louisiana. The plantation stood as more than just a collection of buildings or acres of farmland. It embodied the blending of traditions, resilience, and identity of a community that had carved its place into a world that often tried to deny its existence. Within its grounds, art, music, and stories flourished, keeping alive the memory of those who had worked the land before and laying a foundation for generations that followed. But her family's influence extended beyond the plantation itself. They became central figures in the establishment of the Isle-Brevelle Creole community, a settlement that represented something rare and deeply significant in American history, a self-sustaining society where Creoles of color thrived economically, socially, and culturally despite the challenges of their time. This was not a story of wealth alone, but of identity, belonging, and the preservation of heritage in a land that often pressed people to forget or abandon their roots. Isle-Brevelle became a haven where language, customs, and traditions were passed down through generations, where families built lives that honored both their African and European ancestry, and where the blending of cultures was not just tolerated but celebrated. The heartbeat of this community pulsed strongly in its spiritual life, and it was here that her descendants also left a mark that continues to resonate. They established Augustine Parish Church, which stands today as one of the oldest churches founded by and for people of African descent in the United States. It became a landmark not just of faith but of resilience and unity, a place where people gathered to worship, to celebrate, and to find strength in one another. The church was not simply a building of wood and stone. It was a symbol of the community's determination to endure, to claim their place in history, and to create institutions that would serve as pillars for generations. Through these contributions, the construction of Merrow's Plantation, the founding of Isle-Brevelle, and the creation of Augustine Parish Church, her descendants ensured that her vision did not fade into obscurity. They carried forward the legacy of a woman who had risen from bondage to independence, expanding her story into something much greater than herself. Their lives became interwoven with the broader tapestry of African American heritage, illustrating that history is not only shaped by singular figures, but also by the communities and traditions that grow from their seeds. What began as one woman's determination to own land and provide for her children blossomed into a cultural heritage that scholars, artists, and descendants continue to study, honor, and celebrate. Even today, when visitors walk the grounds of Merrow's Plantation or attend a service at Augustine Parish Church, they are not simply stepping into old buildings but into living history. A history born of endurance, vision, and an unyielding belief in the possibility of building something lasting in the face of immense obstacles. Each structure, each tradition, and each story preserved within these spaces whispers of the journey that began with her, a journey that crossed boundaries of race and class, and a journey that continues to inspire, It is easy to think of history as something fixed, a collection of dates and events recorded in books. But the story of her descendants proves otherwise. Their contributions remind us that history is alive, breathing through communities that still exist, songs that are still sung, and families who still gather in the same places where their ancestors once dreamed of a better life. The Isle Brevel community remains a living testament to this, where traditions of food, music, and language echo back to centuries past, and yet continue to evolve with each generation. The significance of their legacy lies not only in the physical landmarks they built, but in the way they asserted their right to shape their own story. In a world that often denied agency to people of their heritage, they claimed it fully, creating places where dignity and culture could flourish. Their story challenges us to rethink what resilience looks like, and to see heritage not just as something to be remembered, but as something to be lived and carried forward. Thus, when we speak of her today, we are not only recalling the extraordinary journey of one woman who rose to prominence despite unimaginable barriers. We are also honoring the enduring community that grew from her determination. Her life was the spark, but her descendants became the flame that continues to burn brightly, illuminating the path of African American heritage and showing how legacies, once planted, can grow into forests of memory, culture, an identity that stands strong for centuries. Under the long shadow of history, the story of Cecile and her descendants finds its closing chapter not in silence, but in the resounding echoes of courage and sacrifice. When the Civil War tore America apart, families everywhere were split between loyalty to the Union and loyalty to the Confederacy, and her descendants were no exception. Some wore the gray, others the blue, their decisions shaped by circumstance, geography, and the unrelenting turbulence of their times. Yet from this divide emerged a figure whose bravery would etch itself into the annals of American history: Lieutenant André Cailloux. Believed to be her great-grandson, Cailloux's name lives on because of what he represented: a man of African descent leading Union troops in a war that was as much about freedom as it was about preserving a nation. In 1863, during the brutal siege of Port Hudson, Louisiana, he stood at the forefront of his men, a symbol of both defiance and determination. The assault was fierce, with bullets tearing through the humid southern air, cannons shaking the very ground beneath the soldiers' boots. Cailloux fought not just against Confederate defenses, but against the weight of prejudice that sought to deny men like him the dignity of leadership. When he fell in battle, struck down while rallying his troops under relentless fire, his death was not the end of his story. His sacrifice reverberated across the Union, celebrated in newspapers and spoken of in reverent tones. For many, he became a martyr of freedom, embodying the promise that African Americans, too, would shape the destiny of the United States. For his family, and for all who shared his heritage, his courage was the culmination of generations of resilience, a direct continuation of the strength first seen in Cecile, who had defied the chains of bondage to carve out a life for herself and her descendants. Think of that extraordinary arc. From an enslaved woman brought to Louisiana under the harshest of conditions, to a lineage that built plantations, founded communities, established churches, and ultimately produced a soldier who died with honor on a battlefield for freedom. It is a story that underscores the resilience of the human spirit, a story of transformation through blood, sacrifice, and unyielding determination. Where once her name may have been overlooked, her legacy became undeniable through the achievements and sacrifices of those who carried her bloodline forward. What makes this story even more remarkable is how it connects the seemingly disparate strands of American history into one woven tapestry. The Creole community of Isle Brevel, with its vibrant traditions and cultural identity, did not appear by chance. It was built through the determination of her descendants. The church they established, Augustine Parish, became more than just a place of worship. It was a sanctuary of identity and resilience. a living monument to a people who refuse to let their heritage be erased. And then, years later, one of their own would carry that heritage onto the battlefield, where faith and courage converged in the face of mortal danger. Chesile's story, and that of her descendants, is not just about survival. It is about transformation. It is about how pain can give way to perseverance, how loss can be turned into legacy, and how the strength of one individual can ripple outward through centuries. Her journey reminds us that history is not made only by kings, generals, or presidents, but by ordinary people whose lives take extraordinary turns. And so, as we close this chapter, we are left with a profound sense of continuity. From the cane fields of Louisiana to the church pews of Isle-Breville, from the battle lines at Port Hudson to the memories preserved today, the story of this family is one of resilience and inspiration. It challenges us to remember the countless untold stories that form the foundation of our shared past, and it invites us to honor the courage it takes to not only survive but to build, to create, and to sacrifice for something greater than oneself. If you have journeyed with us through this story, thank you for listening, for remembering, and for honoring the lives that shaped it. If this tale of resilience and legacy has moved you, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others who care about history's hidden voices. Each action helps ensure that stories like this continue to find their place in the world, rather than being left in silence. For now, I will leave you with this thought. History is never truly past, it lives on in the choices we make, in the communities we build, and in the courage we summon when times are hardest. May this story remind us that even in the darkest chapters,